You see others take bold career moves that pay off spectacularly while you're stuck analyzing every decision to death. You're tired of watching opportunities slip by because you couldn't decide if the risk was worth it, while competitors seem to have an instinct for which chances to take. I am Sun Tzu, and I learned that in warfare, those who calculate risk properly live to fight another day, while those who guess poorly become casualties. The strategic risk principles I'll share will give you a framework for making confident decisions under uncertainty. What I discovered on ancient battlefields about calculated aggression, strategic timing, and reading invisible advantages will transform how you approach every important choice in your career and life. Whether you're facing enemy armies or market competition, the ability to assess risk with precision separates victors from victims. Start by liking this video, subscribing for more battlefield wisdom, and commenting your location below. Let's see how far this strategic knowledge needs to travel. I was not born a master strategist. My journey into understanding calculated risk began as a young officer in the courts of ancient China, where I witnessed firsthand how poor decision-making could destroy armies and kingdoms. The artifact that haunts me still is the memory of my first commander moment when hesitation nearly cost me everything I would later achieve. I remember standing before my first battalion, barely old enough to grow a proper beard, watching seasoned commanders freeze when faced with uncertainty. These were men who could recite military classics from memory, who understood formations and logistics. Yet when the moment came to act with incomplete information, they became paralyzed. I watched armies lose, not because they faced superior enemies, but because their leaders couldn't distinguish between necessary caution and fatal hesitation. My awakening came during a border skirmish, where our commanding general spent 3 days debating whether to advance or retreat. Every hour of delay gave our enemies time to strengthen their position, call for reinforcements, and study our movements. I realized then that perfect certainty is the luxury of hindsight, not the tool of victory. While he waited for absolute confirmation of enemy numbers, I observed that our scouts brought increasingly dire reports. The day of inaction was itself a decision, and a costly one. That night, I made my first calculated risk. Against protocol, I led a small reconnaissance mission to gather the intelligence our general needed. What I discovered changed my understanding of risk forever. The enemy camp was in chaos, their supplies were running low, their morale was breaking, and they were preparing to retreat. Our general's caution had nearly allowed a weakened enemy to escape and regroup. When I reported my findings, I didn't just present the facts, I presented a framework. I had learned to separate what we knew, what we could reasonably infer, and what we needed to accept as unknown variables. This became my first lesson in calculated risk. Uncertainty is not the absence of information, but the presence of incomplete information that still allows for intelligent action. The next morning, our general ordered the advance. We captured the enemy position with minimal casualties, not because we had achieved perfect intelligence, but because we had gathered sufficient intelligence and acted while the window of opportunity remained open. The victory belonged not to the cautious or the reckless, but to those who could calculate probability within acceptable margins of error. From that day forward, I devoted myself to understanding the mathematics of uncertainty. I studied how great commanders throughout history had made decisions with incomplete information, how they had balanced the cost of action against the cost of inaction, and how they had developed the confidence to commit resources based on probability rather than certainty. What I learned was that the greatest risk in warfare and in life is not taking calculated risks, but failing to recognize that inaction is itself a choice with consequences. Every moment spent seeking perfect information is a moment your competitors use to seize advantages, strengthen positions, and close opportunities. The art is not in eliminating uncertainty, but in acting wisely despite it. The most dangerous enemy I ever faced was not a rival army, but a commander's obsession with complete knowledge. I carry with me the memory of a campaign map incomplete, with vast territories marked simply as unknown, that taught me the fatal flaw of waiting for perfect information. During my 3rd year of command, I served under General Wei, a brilliant tactician who believed that knowledge was the ultimate weapon. He would spend weeks gathering intelligence, sending scout after scout to map every hill, count every enemy soldier, and document every supply route. His maps were works of art, detailed to an extraordinary degree, but they shared one fatal characteristic. They were always incomplete, and by the time he deemed them sufficient, the strategic landscape had changed entirely. I watched this obsession destroy what should have been our greatest victory. We faced an enemy force that was retreating through a mountain pass, perfect opportunity to cut off their escape and capture their entire army. Our scouts reported the enemy's position, their approximate numbers, and their direction of travel. We had perhaps 6 hours to position our forces to block the pass before they escaped into friendly territory. General Wei studied the reports and declared them insufficient. He wanted to know the exact number of enemy soldiers, their precise formation, the condition of their supplies, and the loyalty of their commanders. He dispatched additional scouts with orders to return with complete intelligence before any action would be taken. I understood his caution, but I also understood the mathematics of opportunity. Every hour we delayed, the enemy moved closer to safety. The window for decisive action was closing, not because we lacked sufficient information to act, but because we insisted on information that was both unnecessary and impossible to obtain in the time available. I approached General Wei with what I called my map of unknowns, a strategic assessment that clearly separated what we knew with certainty, what we could reasonably estimate, and what would remain unknown regardless of how long we waited. We knew the enemy was retreating. We could estimate their numbers within a range that didn't affect our tactical options, and we understood their limited routes of escape. The unknowns, their exact supply situation, internal politics, and detailed formation were interesting but irrelevant to the decision at hand. The general dismissed my analysis as premature. He insisted that moving without complete intelligence was reckless gambling, not strategic thinking. By the time his scouts returned, with the detailed reports he demanded, the enemy had escaped. We learned their exact numbers, their supply situation, and even the names of their commanders. But this perfect information was now perfectly useless. That night, I developed what became my fundamental principle of sufficient clarity. The goal is not to eliminate uncertainty, but to reduce it to levels that allow for confident action. I learned to ask not do we know everything, but do we know enough to act with acceptable risk. The principle applies beyond military campaigns. In your career, you will never have complete information about the company you're considering joining, the market you're entering, or the project you're launching. The leaders who succeed are not those who wait for certainty, but those who can identify the minimum viable information needed for intelligent action and then act while opportunities remain available. Perfect information is the enemy of timely action, and timely action often matters more than perfect planning. War taught me that survival depends not on avoiding all risks, but on calculating them with mathematical precision. The artifact that changed my approach to decision-making was a simple counting device, an abacus used by my war council that forced us to transform emotional reactions into quantifiable assessments. During the siege of Yangzhou, I faced a decision that would determine the fate of 10,000 soldiers under my command. The enemy had surrounded the city, cutting off our supply lines and forcing us into a defensive position that grew weaker by the day. Traditional military thinking suggested we wait for reinforcement or attempt to outlast the siege, but my mathematical analysis revealed a different truth. I gathered my war council around a simple abacus, not to count supplies or soldiers, but to calculate the probability of survival under different scenarios. This was revolutionary thinking. Most commanders relied on intuition, experience, and emotion when making life or death decisions. I insisted we reduce our options to numbers that could be compared objectively. We identified 3 potential courses of action: maintain the siege defense, attempt a diplomatic surrender, or execute a nighttime breakout assault. For each option, we calculated 3 critical variables: the probability of success, the potential impact of failure, and the resources required for execution. The defensive option showed a 30% chance of success, but success meant losing 60% of our forces to starvation and disease before relief arrived. The impact of failure was total annihilation, and the resource requirement was simply enduring until our supplies ran out in 18 days. Diplomatic surrender offered 90% probability that our lives would be spared, but 100% certainty that our military careers would end and our families would face dishonor. The resource requirement was swallowing our pride and accepting defeat. The breakout assault presented 70% probability of success in escaping the siege, with potential losses of 25% of our forces during the attempt. Failure meant the same total annihilation as the defensive option, but success meant preserving 75% of our army to fight again. Using my framework, probability times impact times resources equals decision threshold, the mathematics became clear. The breakout assault offered the highest probability of achieving our strategic objective, preserving our fighting force, while maintaining honor and position for future campaigns. But the calculation revealed something deeper than tactics. It forced us to define what we meant by acceptable loss. This was perhaps the most difficult aspect of strategic thinking, acknowledging that every decision involves potential sacrifice, and that refusing to calculate these costs doesn't eliminate them, it simply makes them unpredictable. The night assault succeeded. We broke through the enemy lines with losses of exactly 23% of our forces, close to our mathematical prediction. More importantly, the 77% who survived became the core of victories in 3 subsequent campaigns. The mathematics had worked not because it eliminated risk, but because it helped us choose the risk most likely to serve our larger strategic goals. I learned to separate my emotional attachment to perfect outcomes from my rational assessment of probable outcomes. Fear wanted us to avoid all risk by maintaining the siege defense. Pride wanted us to reject surrender regardless of consequences. Only mathematical analysis revealed the path that balanced our various objectives within acceptable margins of loss. This framework applies to every significant decision in modern careers and business. When evaluating a job change, career pivot, or business investment, you must identify your probability of success, calculate the potential impact of various outcomes, and honestly assess the resources required. The goal is not to eliminate uncertainty, but to make uncertainty manageable through systematic analysis. The most crucial intelligence often comes not from what people tell you, but from what they cannot hide. I learned this through an artifact I treasure: a silent report from a scout who couldn't speak, yet delivered the most valuable intelligence of my career through observation alone. During the campaign against the Zhou Confederation, we faced an enemy whose movements seemed unpredictable and whose intentions remained hidden despite our extensive intelligence network. Traditional scouting had provided basic information about troop positions and supply routes, but something felt incomplete. The enemy's behavior suggested desperation, yet their actions appeared confident and coordinated. I assigned my most observant scout, a man who had lost his voice to a throat wound but possessed extraordinary powers of observation, to spend 3 days studying the enemy camp from concealed positions. He could not interrogate prisoners or eavesdrop on conversations, But he could see patterns that speaking scouts often missed because they focused on gathering verbal intelligence. When he returned, his silent report revealed what our other intelligence had missed. The enemy soldiers were eating only once per day, always at the same time, and their portions were smaller than standard military rations. Their horses showed signs of poor nutrition, yet the animals were being groomed more frequently than usual. Sign that appearances were being maintained for morale purposes. More telling were the behavioral patterns. Sentries changed posts every 2 hours instead of the standard 4-hour rotation, suggesting either extreme caution or insufficient personnel. Officers made frequent inspections of the same supply areas, indicating either abundance requiring careful management or scarcity demanding constant monitoring. The decisive observation was the simplest. Enemy soldiers were repairing equipment instead of replacing it, and they were doing so with materials scavenged from abandoned positions rather than from their supply trains. This suggested their supply situation was far more desperate than their confident tactical movements indicated. I developed what became my framework for reading invisible signals in any competitive environment. First, identify the resource constraints that every organization faces: time, personnel, materials, information, and morale. Second, observe which constraints are being managed most carefully, because excessive attention usually indicates scarcity rather than abundance. Third, look for mismatches between projected confidence and actual behavior, because maintaining appearances requires resources that desperate organizations can't spare for long. Armed with this intelligence, I recognized that the enemy's aggressive posturing was actually a bluff designed to discourage our attack while they searched for an escape route. Their apparent strength was actually a display of weakness, performed convincingly enough to fool observers who relied only on direct intelligence. We attacked at dawn, targeting their weakest supply positions rather than their strongest defensive formations. The enemy collapsed within hours, not because we had superior forces, but because we had superior understanding of their true situation. This principle applies directly to modern competitive environments. In business negotiations, the company that spends most time discussing financial strength is often the one with cash flow problems. In office politics, the manager who constantly emphasizes their authority is usually the one whose position is most insecure. In career advancement, the colleague who talks most about their opportunities elsewhere is often the one most desperate for recognition in their current role. Learn to read the invisible battlefield by observing resource allocation patterns, identifying mismatches between stated confidence and actual behavior, and recognizing when excessive attention to appearances indicates underlying weakness. The most valuable intelligence comes not from what people say, but from what their actions reveal about their true situation and constraints. True power lies not in constant aggression or perpetual caution, but in the precise application of force at the moment when success becomes inevitable. The artifact that taught me this principle was observing a tiger hunt-watching how the predator could remain motionless for hours, then strike with devastating speed when the perfect opportunity presented itself. I learned calculated aggression during the campaign against the mountain fortresses of the Bay Kingdom. We had spent 2 months in what appeared to be a defensive stalemate, with enemy forces holding superior positions in mountain strongholds that seemed impregnable to direct assault. My officers grew restless, some advocating for immediate attack to maintain troop morale, others suggesting strategic withdrawal to avoid costly siege warfare. I chose a third, path-aggressive patience. While maintaining the appearance of defensive positioning, I was actually engineering the conditions for overwhelming offensive success. Every day of apparent inaction was actually a day of preparation, positioning, and intelligence gathering designed to create a moment when aggressive action would achieve decisive results with minimal risk. The breakthrough came when I recognized that the enemy's strength, their mountain fortifications, could become their greatest vulnerability under the right circumstances. Their elevated positions provided excellent defense but terrible logistics. Every supply run required exposed travel through valley corridors that we could monitor and, when the time was right, completely control. I waited through the seasonal rains, allowing the enemy to believe our delay indicated weakness or indecision. During this period, I positioned small units to monitor every supply route, identified the exact timing of enemy resupply operations, and calculated the precise moment when their supply situation would become critical. When I finally ordered the attack, it appeared sudden and overwhelming to both enemy forces and my own officers. In reality, it was the culmination of weeks of systematic preparation designed to concentrate maximum force at the moment of enemy vulnerability. We captured all 3 mountain fortresses in a single coordinated assault that lasted less than 6 hours. The principle I developed is this: calculated aggression means creating conditions where bold action becomes low-risk action. The tiger doesn't attack constantly, it positions itself where a single strike will be sufficient. Similarly, strategic leaders don't act aggressively because they're impatient or desperate. They act aggressively because they've engineered circumstances where aggression will be decisive. This approach requires distinguishing between 3 types of aggressive action. Reckless aggression acts without adequate preparation or intelligence, hoping that boldness alone will overcome obstacles. Defensive aggression reacts to immediate threats without considering long-term positioning. Calculated aggression deliberately creates advantageous conditions, then applies concentrated force when success probability is highest. In modern career and business contexts, calculated aggression means identifying your competition's vulnerable moments when they're overextended, distracted, or resource-constrained and positioning yourself to capitalize on those opportunities. It means building capabilities during stable periods so you can act decisively when market conditions shift in your favor. Most people misunderstand timing in competitive environments. They believe you should attack when you feel strongest, but strategic thinking suggests you should attack when your opponent is weakest, regardless of your absolute strength. The goal is not to demonstrate power, but to achieve objectives with minimum resistance and maximum efficiency. Calculated aggression transforms apparent opportunities into actual advantages by ensuring that bold action is supported by superior preparation, positioning, and timing. When executed properly, what appears to be a risky, aggressive move is actually the lowest risk path to achieving your strategic objectives. The most formidable enemy I ever faced looked back at me from my own reflection. The artifact that changed my understanding of courage was not a weapon or a battle standard, but a bronze mirror that forced me to confront the difference between fearlessness and true bravery. My encounter with this enemy within came during my first independent command, when I was assigned to defend a strategic river crossing against a force that outnumbered my troops 3-1. The night before the expected attack, I stood alone in my tent, studying maps and battle plans, when I caught sight of my reflection in a polished bronze mirror that had belonged to my predecessor. What I saw disturbed me more than any enemy formation. My hands were trembling slightly as I traced defensive positions on the map. My breathing was shallow and rapid, despite my efforts to appear calm. Most unsettling of all, I was spending more time planning for retreat than for victory. Fear was not just affecting my confidence, it was undermining my strategic thinking. I had always believed that great commanders were fearless, that courage meant the absence of fear rather than action despite fear. That night, I realized this belief was not only wrong but dangerous. Fear, I discovered, was not my enemy, was information. The trembling hands told me my body understood the stakes of tomorrow's battle. The rapid breathing indicated my mind was processing multiple threat scenarios simultaneously. The retreat planning revealed my subconscious assessment that our defensive position might not hold. Instead of fighting these fear responses, I began analyzing them as intelligence reports. From my own psychological reconnaissance, what exactly was I afraid of? Losing the battle was obvious, but deeper examination revealed more specific concerns. Making decisions too slowly under pressure, misreading enemy intentions, losing the confidence of my troops, and failing to recognize when tactical flexibility was required. Each fear pointed to a specific area where preparation could reduce uncertainty. I was afraid of slow decision-making, so I developed contingency protocols that would allow rapid response to changing conditions. I feared misreading enemy intentions, so I established multiple observation points and communication systems to maintain real-time intelligence. I worried about troop confidence, so I spent the remaining hours before battle explaining our strategy and ensuring every soldier understood not just their role, but the reasoning behind our defensive approach. By dawn, my fear had not disappeared, but it had been transformed from paralyzing anxiety into analytical advantage. When the enemy attack began, I noticed that my heightened awareness, what I had initially experienced as fear, allowed me to detect tactical shifts and respond to opportunities that a truly fearless commander might have missed. The battle was won not through the absence of fear, but through the disciplined conversion of fear into enhanced strategic awareness. My troops later commented that I had seemed exceptionally calm under pressure, not realizing that what they interpreted as confidence was actually fear that had been processed through systematic analysis and preparation. This experience taught me that courage is not the absence of fear, but the transformation of fear into useful information. Fear tells you where your uncertainties lie, what variables you haven't adequately considered, and which scenarios require additional preparation. The goal is not to eliminate fear, but to ensure that fear enhances rather than impairs your decision-making capabilities. In modern competitive environments, this principle applies to every high-stakes decision. When you feel anxious about a career change, promotion, opportunity, or business investment, treat that anxiety as intelligence rather than weakness. What specific outcomes are you afraid of? Which variables feel uncertain? What additional preparation would convert your fears into confidence? Fear becomes your strategic ally when you use it to identify and address the real risks that matter. The most courageous decision I ever made was to run away. The artifact that taught me this paradox was a tactical withdrawal map that transformed apparent defeat into overwhelming future victory, proving that retreat can be the most aggressive strategy of all. During the winter campaign against the Eastern Alliance, I commanded a force that had achieved several tactical victories, but found itself dangerously overextended in hostile territory. My officers urged me to consolidate our gains by establishing permanent defensive positions in the territory we had captured. The conventional wisdom suggested that retreat would surrender hard-won advantages and demoralize troops who had fought bravely for these victories. I studied the strategic situation and reached a conclusion that shocked my war council. Our victories had become our greatest vulnerability. Each captured position required garrison troops, reducing our mobile striking force. Each mile of advance extended our supply lines through territory where enemy forces could harass our logistics. Each day we remained in static positions allowed enemy forces to study our dispositions and plan coordinated counterattacks. The withdrawal map I developed showed something my officers couldn't see. By retreating to positions closer to our supply bases, we would actually strengthen our overall strategic position while creating opportunities for decisive future action. The retreat would appear to be a defeat, but it would actually be preparation for victory. The decision required overcoming not just enemy pressure, but the psychological resistance of my own forces. Soldiers who had risked their lives to capture territory struggled to understand why we would voluntarily surrender it. Officers worried that retreat would be interpreted as admission of failure. I faced the challenge of maintaining morale while implementing a strategy that appeared, on the surface, to contradict everything we had been fighting to achieve. I explained the withdrawal using what became my framework for strategic retreat: temporary tactical loss in service of permanent strategic gain. We were not running from the enemy, we were repositioning to destroy them more completely than would be possible from our current overextended positions. The retreat took place over 5 days, with our forces appearing to flee in disorder while actually executing a carefully planned repositioning that drew enemy forces into terrain of our choosing. By the time the Eastern Alliance realized our retreat was strategic rather than desperate, they had committed their reserves to pursuing what they believed was a defeated army. The trap closed when they reached the killing ground. I had selected a valley where their superior numbers became a disadvantage and their extended supply lines became targets for the fresh reserves I had positioned during the retreat. The enemy force that had been on the verge of victory found itself surrounded and cut off from reinforcement or resupply. The resulting battle was not close. We destroyed the entire Eastern Alliance army in a single engagement, capturing resources and territory far beyond what we had temporarily surrendered during the retreat. More importantly, the psychological impact of their devastating defeat convinced other potential enemies that challenging our forces was futile. This experience taught me that strategic retreat serves multiple purposes beyond immediate tactical positioning. It conserves resources for more favorable engagements, draws opponents into overconfident pursuit, creates opportunities to reset the terms of competition, and demonstrates the discipline required for long-term strategic thinking in modern career and business contexts. Strategic retreat means recognizing when short-term losses serve long-term objectives. This might mean leaving a prestigious position that offers no growth opportunities, abandoning a market segment that drains resources without generating sustainable profits, or ending business relationships that consume energy without creating value. The key is distinguishing between strategic retreat and simple failure. Strategic retreat is voluntary, temporary, and designed to create future advantages. It requires clear vision of improved positioning and specific plans for capitalizing on the advantages that retreat will create. Most importantly, it demands the courage to accept short-term criticism in service of long-term success. The greatest victory of my career was achieved not through superior strategy or individual brilliance, but through understanding how to multiply limited resources by aligning with others who shared compatible objectives. The artifact that represents this principle is an alliance charter, formal agreement that transformed 5 weak armies into one unstoppable force. I faced this challenge during the campaign against the Northern Confederation, an enemy whose combined forces outnumbered my army by more than 10-1. Traditional military thinking suggested this was an impossible situation, requiring either desperate tactics or strategic withdrawal. I chose a third option, transforming the mathematical equation through alliance building. The Northern Confederation appeared monolithic from a distance, but closer examination revealed internal tensions and competing interests among its member states. Some Confederates had joined from fear rather than conviction. Others had territorial disputes with their supposed allies, and several faced domestic problems that made prolonged military commitment difficult. I spent 3 weeks not preparing for battle, but preparing for negotiation. I identified potential allies among the Confederation's enemies, neutral parties who feared northern expansion, and even disaffected members within the Confederation itself. My goal was not to recruit traditional military allies, but to create a coalition of interests that would redistribute the strategic balance. The alliance charter I developed did not require unanimous agreement on all objectives, an impossible standard that would have prevented any cooperation. Instead, it established a framework where each party could pursue their specific interests while contributing to shared strategic goals. The mountain clans wanted independence from northern interference, the river cities needed trade route protection, and the southern kingdoms sought to prevent northern territorial expansion. Our formal agreement specified that each ally would contribute resources according to their capabilities, rather than matching each other's commitment levels. The mountain clans provided scouts and knowledge of terrain. The river cities supplied logistics and communication networks, and the southern kingdoms contributed heavy cavalry and siege equipment. My forces served as the coordinating element that unified these diverse capabilities into coherent strategic action. The result was a coalition that could field forces superior to the Northern Confederation while sharing risks among multiple parties. More importantly, the alliance created strategic flexibility that no single army could achieve. When the enemy concentrated against one ally, others could attack exposed positions. When enemy forces attempted to retreat, multiple armies could coordinate to prevent escape. The decisive engagement lasted only 2 days, because the Northern Confederation found itself surrounded and outnumbered despite their initial numerical superiority. They had prepared to fight one army and instead faced 5 armies operating with unified command and shared intelligence. But the greater victory was the framework I developed for evaluating alliance: opportunities, complementary capabilities, compatible objectives, and shared risk distribution. Complementary capabilities meant each ally contributed different strengths rather than duplicating existing resources. Compatible objectives ensured that alliance members could achieve their individual goals through collective action. Shared risk distribution prevented any single party from bearing disproportionate costs or dangers. This principle applies directly to modern career advancement and business development. The most successful professionals understand that individual achievement is limited by personal capabilities, but collective achievement through strategic partnerships can overcome almost any competitive disadvantage. In business contexts, this means identifying potential partners whose capabilities complement rather than compete with your strengths, whose market objectives align with your expansion goals, and whose resources can be combined with yours to create competitive advantages that neither party could achieve independently. The key insight is that alliance building requires shifting from zero-sum thinking to value creation thinking. Instead of viewing others as competitors for limited opportunities, strategic thinkers identify ways to expand opportunities through cooperation, creating situations where all parties can achieve more together than they could accomplish alone. War taught me that information is a weapon, and controlling what your enemies believe about your capabilities can be more powerful than the capabilities themselves. The artifact that exemplifies this principle is a false Banara military standard that displayed misleading information about our forces, creating strategic advantages through carefully managed perceptions. During the siege of Wucheng, I commanded a force that was significantly smaller and less well equipped than the enemy. Defending the city, direct assault would have resulted in catastrophic losses, while prolonged siege would have allowed enemy reinforcements to arrive and trap my army between the city walls and relief forces. Victory required making the enemy believe our situation was stronger than reality while convincing potential reinforcements that intervention was unnecessary. The false banner I designed displayed the insignia of 3 different military units, suggesting our force was actually a combined army rather than a single regiment. We positioned this banner prominently during daylight hours, ensuring enemy scouts would report our apparent strength to their commanders. More subtly, we rotated different uniforms and equipment among our soldiers, creating the impression of diverse units with specialized capabilities. But the more sophisticated deception involved our camp management. We maintained fires and activity patterns consistent with a force 3 times our actual size. constructed false supply areas that suggested abundant resources, and established communication routines that implied coordination with additional forces positioned beyond enemy observation. The psychological effect was exactly what I intended. The city defenders became cautious rather than aggressive, believing they faced a superior force that could afford to wait for optimal conditions. Potential relief forces received reports suggesting that our army was too strong to challenge directly, causing delays while they gathered additional troops that would never be sufficient. Meanwhile, I used the time gained through deception to solve the real tactical problems. While the enemy waited for us to reveal our supposed overwhelming strength, we identified weak points in their defenses, established secure communication with sympathizers inside the city, and positioned our actual forces for a precisely targeted assault that would succeed through accuracy rather than overwhelming power. The attack, when it came, exploited the enemy's misperceptions about our capabilities and intentions. They had prepared for siege warfare against a massive army and instead faced a surgical strike by a smaller force that had studied their vulnerabilities in detail. The city fell in 6 hours with minimal casualties on both sides. This experience taught me the ethical framework I developed for strategic deception. Misdirection about capabilities and intentions is legitimate, but deception about fundamental character or long-term objectives destroys the trust necessary for any sustainable advantage. The goal is to control how others assess your competitive position, not to betray their trust in your integrity. The principle applies directly to modern competitive environments. In business negotiations, revealing all your constraints and alternatives weakens your position unnecessarily. In career advancement, displaying confidence about opportunities you're developing can influence how others assess your value and potential. In market competition, controlling perceptions about your capabilities can discourage competitors from challenging your position. The key distinction is between deception that provides tactical advantage and deception that undermines long-term relationships. Strategic misdirection about your current capabilities, resources, or timing can create competitive advantages without violating ethical boundaries. However, deception about your fundamental values, long-term commitments, or treatment of partners will eventually destroy the trust that makes business relationships possible. Effective strategic deception requires understanding what information others need to make decisions about engaging with you, then managing that information to influence their risk calculations in your favor. This is not about lying or betrayal, but about controlling the timing and context of information disclosure to maintain competitive advantage while preserving the integrity necessary for sustainable success. The most unexpected lesson warfare taught me was that speed can transform higher-risk situations into low-risk victories, while hesitation can make even favorable situations dangerous. The artifact that embodies this principle is a lightning campaign. Map a battle plan showing rapid movement routes that created decisive advantages through superior timing rather than superior force. I discovered this principle during what became known as the Three Rivers Campaign, where I faced the challenge of defeating 3 separate enemy armies before they could coordinate their efforts against my single force. Traditional strategy suggested avoiding this scenario entirely, since fighting multiple enemies simultaneously violates fundamental military principles. I chose instead to embrace the situation by moving so rapidly that I could engage each enemy force individually while they believed they were participating in coordinated action. The Lightning Campaign map I developed showed movement routes that would allow my army to cover distances in half the expected time. This required abandoning conventional logistics approaches, traveling with minimal supplies, and accepting the risk that rapid movement might exhaust my troops before decisive engagements. The alternative, allowing the 3 armies to combine, guaranteed defeat regardless of our condition. The first engagement occurred at dawn on the third day of forced marches. The Eastern Army had positioned itself to block what they assumed would be our logical approach route, but our accelerated timeline meant we arrived 12 hours before they expected any possible contact. We attacked while they were still establishing defensive positions, achieving complete tactical surprise despite fighting in broad daylight. On open terrain, the victory was decisive precisely because of our speed. The Eastern Army had no opportunity to send warning messages to their allies, no time to implement their prepared defensive strategies, and no chance to coordinate the mutual support that their campaign plan required. Speed had converted our numerical disadvantage into overwhelming local superiority at the decisive moment. The second engagement followed the same pattern. We covered the distance to the Central Army's position in 18 hours apace. They considered impossible for a force that had just fought a major battle. When we appeared on their flanks while they were still marching toward what they believed would be the eastern battlefield, their tactical situation became hopeless before they understood what was happening. The Third Army surrendered without fighting when they received news that both their allies had been destroyed by an enemy force that could apparently teleport across the landscape. Our speed had created a psychological impact beyond its tactical advantages, convincing the remaining enemy that resistance was futile against an opponent who could be anywhere at any time. The campaign demonstrated that velocity often matters more than perfect preparation. Each enemy army had developed sophisticated battle plans, established strong defensive positions, and coordinated detailed logistics, but all their careful planning became irrelevant when they could not execute it within their anticipated timeline. I learned that speed creates its own advantages. It compresses enemy decision-making time, prevents coordination between separate threats, capitalizes on temporary opportunities before they disappear, and creates psychological pressure that can cause opponents to make errors they would avoid under normal circumstances. However, speed also amplifies risks. Rapid movement prevents thorough reconnaissance, limits flexibility to respond to unexpected situations, increases logistical vulnerabilities, and can exhaust resources needed for sustained operations. The art lies in recognizing when speed advantages outweigh speed risks. In modern business and career contexts, this principle applies to market opportunities, competitive responses, and strategic positioning. When markets shift or new opportunities emerge, the first organizations to adapt often capture disproportionate advantages. When competitors announce new strategies, rapid counter-moves can neutralize their initiatives before they gain momentum. The key is developing organizational capabilities that enable rapid execution when circumstances favor speed over deliberation. This means maintaining flexible resource allocation, establishing decision-making processes that can function under time pressure, and building teams comfortable with acting on incomplete information when timing becomes critical. The harshest teacher in warfare is not the enemy, but the unforgiving mathematics of supply and logistics. The artifact that taught me this lesson was a campaign logistics scroller, detailed inventory that revealed the gap between ambitious strategies and actual capabilities, showing how resource constraints determine which risks are feasible and which are fantasies. My education in resource reality came during the Western Territories campaign, where I inherited command of an army that had been planned by commanders who confused wishful thinking with strategic planning. The previous leadership had designed a campaign that looked brilliant on maps, but ignored the practical limitations of supply lines, seasonal weather, and troop endurance. The logistics scroll I discovered in the command tent contained calculations that should have prevented the campaign from beginning. Our supply trains could maintain the army for 45 days of normal operations, but the planned campaign required 60 days of sustained advance through territories with no local resources. Our troops were equipped for summer warfare, but the timeline meant we would still be fighting when winter weather made movement nearly impossible. Most critically, the campaign assumed we could live off captured enemy supplies. Despite intelligence reports showing that enemy forces practiced scorched earth tactics, I faced a choice between continuing an unsustainable campaign that would destroy my army through logistical collapse, or acknowledging resource limitations and redesigning our objectives to match our actual capabilities. Pride suggested that a great general should find ways to overcome any obstacle, but mathematics suggested that ignoring resource constraints was the fastest path to catastrophic failure. I chose mathematics over pride. I redesigned the entire campaign around what we could actually sustain rather than what we wished we could achieve. Instead of a 60-day advance to capture distant territorial objectives, I planned a 30-day operation focused on destroying the enemy, mobile forces, and securing resource-rich areas that could support extended operations. The revised campaign logistics showed dramatically different requirements. We could maintain supply lines for 30 days, especially if we captured the granaries and supply depots that intelligence had identified in border territories. We could complete major operations before weather became prohibitive. Most importantly, we could achieve sustainable victories that strengthened rather than weakened our long-term strategic position. The results exceeded expectations precisely because our objectives matched our capabilities. We destroyed 2 enemy armies that had been positioned to defend the distant territories we had originally planned to attack. We captured supply bases that allowed us to extend operations beyond the original 30-day limit. We established forward positions that became launching points for future campaigns. Conducted with adequate preparation and resources, the Western Territories campaign taught me that resource constraints are not obstacles to overcome, but parameters that define realistic objectives. The most brilliant strategy becomes worthless if it requires capabilities you don't possess, resources you can't sustain, or timeline commitments you can't meet. I developed what became my framework for resource reality assessment: honest capability, inventory, sustainability analysis, and contingency planning. Honest capability inventory means documenting what you can actually do, not what you hope to do or what others expect you to do. Sustainability analysis means calculating whether you can maintain effort and resources through the entire timeline required for success. Contingency planning means identifying what happens when resource assumptions prove incorrect. This framework applies directly to modern career and business planning. Most strategic failures result not from poor market analysis or competitive pressure, but from resource miscalculations that make otherwise sound strategies impossible to execute successfully in career development. This means honestly assessing your current skills, available time for development, financial capacity to support transitions, and family or personal commitments that affect your flexibility. In business planning, it means calculating actual cash flow requirements, realistic timeline expectations, and sustainable growth rates that don't overextend organizational capabilities. The goal is not to limit ambitions, but to ensure that ambitious goals are supported by realistic resource planning that makes success probable, rather than hoping that determination alone will overcome practical constraints. The most valuable skill in warfare is not creating perfect plans, but maintaining effectiveness when perfect plans meet imperfect reality. The artifact that taught me this principle was a broken compasser navigation tool that no longer pointed true north, forcing me to develop new methods of finding direction when established systems failed. I learned this lesson during the Autumn River campaign, where everything that could go wrong did go wrong, yet we achieved our strategic objectives by abandoning our original approach entirely. The campaign began with detailed plans based on accurate intelligence, favorable weather forecasts, and coordination with Allied forces that had proven reliable in previous operations. Within 48 hours, our intelligence proved outdated, as enemy forces had moved to unexpected positions. Our weather forecasts failed as early winter storms arrived 3 weeks ahead of schedule, and our Allied forces were delayed by political complications that no one had anticipated. The broken compass became our situation's perfect metaphor. Our primary navigation tools no longer provided reliable guidance. Traditional military doctrine suggested that plan failure indicated inadequate preparation and that commanders should prevent such situations through more thorough advanced planning. I realized this doctrine was fundamentally flawed because it assumed that perfect preparation could account for all variables, when the reality of complex operations is that unexpected variables are inevitable rather than exceptional. Instead of treating planned failure as disaster, I treated it as information. The broken compass told us that our original navigation methods were inadequate for current conditions, but it didn't prevent us from reaching our destination. It simply meant we needed different methods of determining direction. Similarly, our failed campaign plans told us that original assumptions were incorrect, but they didn't prevent us from achieving our objectives through adapted approaches. I developed what became my framework for adaptive strategy: rapid situation reassessment, flexible resource reallocation, and continuous objective refinement. Instead of forcing circumstances to match our plans, we adjusted our plans to exploit current circumstances while maintaining focus on our ultimate strategic goals. The enemy's unexpected positions actually created opportunities we hadn't recognized in our original planning. Their new locations left critical supply lines exposed, allowing us to achieve strategic objectives through indirect approaches that proved more effective than our planned direct assault. The early winter weather that disrupted our logistics also disrupted enemy operations, creating tactical advantages we could exploit if we adapted quickly enough. Most importantly, the delay of our Allied forces freed us from coordination requirements that had limited our flexibility in the original plan. Operating independently allowed us to move faster, change tactics more rapidly, and capitalize on opportunities that would have been impossible with a larger, more complex, combined operation. The adapted campaign succeeded beyond our original objectives, capturing more territory with fewer casualties than the perfect plan would have achieved. This success came not despite our planning failures, but because our planning failures forced us to develop more flexible and responsive operational approaches. The experience taught me that rigid adherence to plans often increases rather than reduces risk, because plans are based on assumptions about future conditions that may prove incorrect. Adaptive thinking recognizes that plans are tools for initial direction, not permanent constraints on action. In modern business and career contexts, this principle means building capabilities for rapid assessment and adjustment rather than perfect prediction and control. Markets change, technologies evolve, and competitive landscapes shift in ways that make even excellent original plans obsolete. The key is developing comfort with uncertainty and building systems that enable rapid adaptation rather than perfect prediction. This means maintaining flexible resource allocation, establishing decision-making processes that can function with incomplete information, and creating organizational cultures that reward intelligent adaptation rather than rigid plan adherence. Most successful leaders understand that their competitive advantage comes not from never encountering unexpected situations, but from responding to unexpected situations more effectively than their competitors can manage. The greatest victories are often built not from single decisive battles, but from chains of smaller triumphs that accumulate into overwhelming advantage. The artifact that taught me this principle was a victory chain, a series of modest battlefield successes that, when linked together, created strategic dominance that no single dramatic action could have achieved. During the Southern Pacification Campaign, I faced an enemy confederation that was too large to defeat in direct confrontation, too dispersed to capture in a single operation, and too well supplied to starve into submission. Traditional approaches suggested either avoiding the conflict entirely or accepting massive casualties in frontal assault. I chose a third path: systematic accumulation of small, manageable victories that would compound into decisive, strategic advantage. The victory chain began with capturing isolated outposts that the enemy considered too minor to defend heavily. Each outpost provided intelligence about larger positions, supplies that reduced our logistical burden, and psychological evidence that the Confederation was not invincible. More importantly, each small victory improved my army's confidence and tactical skills, while creating forward positions for subsequent operations. The second link in the chain targeted the Confederation's communication networks. Instead of attacking their main armies, we disrupted the courier routes and signal systems that allowed coordinated response to our actions. This prevented them from concentrating forces against our small-scale operations, while maintaining their belief that our activities were merely harassment rather than systematic campaign. Each successful operation built capabilities for larger operations, captured supplies, reduced our dependence on distant supply lines, improved tactical experience, made each subsequent engagement more efficient. Growing intelligence networks provided better information for planning future actions. Most importantly, accumulated psychological momentum convinced both our forces and enemy forces that our ultimate success was inevitable. The compound effect became apparent when the Confederation attempted to respond decisively to what they perceived as escalating harassment. They concentrated their main armies to crush our forces in a climactic battle, only to discover that our small victories had systematically eliminated the forward bases, communication systems, and local support networks they needed to sustain large-scale operations. When the decisive engagement finally occurred, it was not close. The Confederation's armies found themselves operating without adequate intelligence, reliable communication, or secure supply lines. Our forces, strengthened by months of successful operations, fought with confidence born from accumulated victory rather than hope. Based on desperate courage, the campaign demonstrated that consistent small wins often create more decisive advantages than dramatic gambles. Each modest success expanded our capabilities while reducing enemy capabilities, creating a mathematical progression where our relative strength increased geometrically rather than arithmetically. I learned that compound victories follow specific patterns. Each success creates platforms for larger successes. Accumulated capabilities enable previously impossible actions. Psychological momentum influences decision-making on both sides, and systematic progress proves more sustainable than sporadic breakthroughs. This principle applies directly to modern career development and business growth. Most professional breakthrough achievements result not from single bold moves, but from consistent accumulation of skills, relationships, and reputation that eventually enable dramatic advancement opportunities. In career contexts, this means focusing on small, manageable improvements in skills, expanding professional networks through consistent relationship building, and establishing reputation for reliability that creates trust for larger responsibilities. Each promotion, successful project, or expanded responsibility creates platforms for even greater opportunities. In business development, compound effects appear in customer acquisition, market penetration, and competitive positioning. Small improvements in customer satisfaction create referral networks that reduce marketing costs. Modest market share gains create economies of scale that enable price advantages. Incremental improvements in efficiency accumulate into significant cost advantages over competitors. The key insight is that small wins are not consolation prizes for people who can't achieve big wins. They are the building blocks that make big wins possible and sustainable. Most dramatic successes that appear sudden to outside observers actually represent the culmination of extended periods of systematic progress that created the capabilities necessary for breakthrough achievement. Strategic thinking recognizes that consistent progress toward well-defined objectives often achieves more than sporadic efforts to accomplish everything at once. Understanding your enemy's mind is more valuable than understanding their weapons. The artifact that taught me this principle was a collection of psychological profiles, detailed assessments of enemy commanders, decision-making patterns that revealed how their personal risk preferences could be exploited for strategic advantage. My education in psychological warfare began during the Jade Valley confrontation, where I faced General Liu Wei, a commander whose tactical skills matched my own, but whose psychological patterns created exploitable vulnerabilities. Instead of focusing solely on his army's capabilities, I devoted equal attention to studying his personal approach to risk assessment and decision-making under pressure. The psychological profile I developed revealed fascinating patterns. General Liu consistently chose defensive positions over offensive opportunities, even when circumstances favored aggression. He preferred elaborate preparation to rapid execution, often missing strategic windows while perfecting tactical details. Most tellingly, he showed extreme aversion to any plan that risked his personal reputation. Even when such plans offered optimal strategic outcomes, I realized that General Liu's risk tolerance was not just a personality trait, was a tactical weakness I could systematically exploit. His caution could be manipulated into paralysis. His preparation requirements could be turned into delays that worked in my favor, and his reputation concerns could be leveraged to force him into suboptimal positions. The strategy I developed presented him with choices designed to exploit his psychological patterns. I created situations where aggressive action offered clear tactical advantages, knowing his defensive instincts would prevent him from capitalizing on opportunities. I established timelines that favored rapid decision-making, understanding that his preparation requirements would cause costly delays. Most effectively, I positioned scenarios where his reputation would suffer regardless of his choice, forcing him to select the option that damaged his strategic position least. The decisive engagement occurred when I offered him an apparent opportunity to achieve a famous victory through a risky frontal assault that would have succeeded with bold execution. His risk aversion prevented him from recognizing that the opportunity was genuine, causing him to assume it was a trap and choose a cautious alternative that played directly into my actual strategy. But the deeper lesson was learning to read risk tolerance patterns in any competitive environment. People reveal their decision-making preferences through small choices long before they face critical decisions. Someone who consistently chooses safe career moves over growth opportunities will likely continue that pattern when facing major strategic choices. Someone who takes calculated risks in small matters will probably maintain that approach in larger situations. I developed a framework for psychological assessment, decision pattern analysis, pressure response evaluation, and motivation hierarchy identification. Decision pattern analysis involves observing how people make choices when facing uncertainty, time pressure, or conflicting information. Pressure response evaluation examines whether someone becomes more cautious or more aggressive when stakes increase. Motivation hierarchy identification determines what someone values most: security, recognition, achievement, or control, and how those priorities influence their risk calculations. This framework applies directly to modern business negotiations, career competition, and market strategy. In salary negotiations, understanding whether your manager is motivated primarily by budget control, team harmony, or individual recognition affects how you present your case. In competitive situations, recognizing whether your rivals are driven by growth ambitions or defensive concerns influences your strategic positioning. The key insight is that most people have consistent risk tolerance patterns that persist across different situations. Someone who avoids financial risk in personal investments will likely avoid strategic risk in business decisions. Someone who thrives on competitive pressure in sports will probably maintain that performance orientation in professional challenges. Effective strategic thinking means designing your approaches to align with others' psychological comfort zones when you need cooperation, and exploiting their psychological limitations when you face competition. This is not manipulation, it's practical application of the reality that all decision-making involves psychological as well as rational factors. Understanding others' risk tolerance allows you to predict their likely responses to different scenarios, position opportunities in ways that maximize acceptance, and avoid triggering defensive reactions that would undermine your objectives. The most profound strategic lesson I learned was that the greatest risks often come not from bold action, but from short-term thinking that sacrifices permanent advantages for temporary gains. The artifact that taught me this principle was a generational strategy mapper, long-term plan, showing how current decisions would affect not just immediate outcomes, but the strategic landscape for decades to come. This understanding crystallized during the final campaign of my active military career, when I faced a choice between achieving a spectacular immediate victory that would enhance my personal reputation, or accepting a modest success that would establish sustainable strategic advantages for my successors. The decision forced me to confront whether I was fighting for my own glory or for enduring strategic objectives. The immediate opportunity was compelling. Enemy forces had made tactical errors that created a chance to destroy their main army in a single decisive battle. Victory would have been complete, dramatic, and personally satisfying. It would have ended the conflict decisively and established my reputation as one of history's great commanders. However, the generational strategy map I developed revealed hidden costs of this approach. The decisive battle would require committing all our reserves, leaving no resources for consolidating territorial gains or establishing defensive positions. The complete destruction of enemy forces would create a power vacuum that neighboring states would inevitably move to fill, potentially creating larger conflicts than the one we were ending. Most importantly, the dramatic victory would depend on tactical methods that could not be systematically taught or reliably repeated by future commanders. The alternative approach offered less immediate satisfaction but greater long-term value. Instead of seeking complete military victory, I could negotiate a settlement that secured key strategic objectives while preserving enemy organizational structure under favorable terms. This would establish sustainable borders, create buffer states that served our long-term interests, and demonstrate strategic principles that future commanders could adapt to their own challenges. I chose the generational perspective over personal glory. The negotiated settlements secured territorial objectives that remained stable for over a century, established diplomatic precedents that prevented future conflicts, and created a strategic framework that allowed smaller forces to maintain advantages that massive armies had struggled to achieve. The decision taught me that legacy thinking requires distinguishing between achievements that enhance your reputation and achievements that create lasting value. Personal recognition often comes from dramatic actions that capture immediate attention, but sustainable strategic advantage comes from systematic approaches that compound over time. I developed what became my framework for legacy evaluation: generational impact assessment, institutional capability building, and knowledge transfer planning. Generational impact assessment means evaluating how current decisions will affect strategic options available to your successors. Institutional capability building means creating systems and processes that enable future success rather than depending on individual excellence. Knowledge transfer planning means documenting principles and methods that others can learn and adapt rather than personal techniques that die with their creator. This perspective transforms how you evaluate risk in modern career and business contexts. Short-term thinking focuses on immediate advancement, quarterly results, and personal recognition. Legacy thinking considers how current choices affect long-term competitive position, organizational capability, and sustainable advantage. In career development, legacy perspective means building skills and relationships that create permanent value rather than temporary position. It means mentoring others whose success will reflect your teaching ability, creating systems that function without your direct involvement, and establishing reputation for principles rather than just achievements. In business, strategy, legacy, thinking means investing in capabilities that compound over time rather than tactics that produce immediate results. It means building customer relationships based on consistent value delivery rather than short-term profit maximization. Developing organizational culture that attracts and retains talent, and creating competitive advantages that become stronger rather than weaker over time. The ultimate insight is that the longest-lasting victories come from understanding what will remain valuable when circumstances change. People retire, and new challenges emerge. Strategic thinking that survives for generations focuses on principles rather than tactics, capabilities rather than achievements, and sustainable advantage rather than temporary dominance. True strategic legacy comes from creating value that extends beyond your direct involvement and influence. The deepest understanding of any principle comes not from personal mastery, but from teaching others to achieve that same mastery. The artifact that represents this truth is a set of teaching stones, simple tools I use to demonstrate complex, strategic principles to student officers, proving that the most sophisticated concepts can be learned when presented through practical application. My transition from practitioner to teacher began when the Emperor assigned me to develop the next generation of military commanders. I had assumed that teaching would be a simple matter of sharing my experiences and explaining my methods. I quickly discovered that knowledge transfer requires completely different skills from knowledge application, and that truly understanding a principle means being able to help others develop that understanding for themselves. The teaching stones became my solution to this challenge. Instead of lecturing about abstract strategic concepts, I created physical exercises that allowed students to discover principles through guided experience. Each stone represented a different variable in strategic decision-making: enemy, strength, supply constraints, terrain advantages, weather factors, and time pressures. Students learned to calculate risk by physically manipulating these variables and observing how changes in one factor affected all others. The breakthrough came when I realized that my best students were not those who memorized my specific tactics, but those who understood the underlying principles well enough to develop their own tactical innovations. Student Commander Zhong Wei exemplified this pattern. He struggled initially with conventional military studies, but excelled once he grasped the fundamental logic of calculated risk assessment. Zhang Wei's defining moment came during a training exercise where he faced a scenario I had never encountered in actual warfare. Using the principles I had taught him about resource allocation, psychological pressure, and timing advantages, he developed a solution that was more elegant than anything I would have devised. His success taught me that effective teaching creates capabilities that exceed the teacher's limitations. This experience revolutionized my understanding of knowledge transfer. I learned that teaching strategic thinking requires 3 distinct phases: principle explanation, guided practice, and independent application. Principle explanation provides the conceptual framework, but understanding remains theoretical until students practice applying concepts to specific situations. independent application tests whether students can adapt principles to novel circumstances, rather than simply repeating learned procedures. The most valuable teaching insight was discovering that explaining concepts to others forces you to understand them more deeply yourself. When students asked questions I couldn't answer immediately, I had to examine my own assumptions and clarify thinking that had become automatic through experience. Teaching revealed gaps in my knowledge that decades of successful practice had not exposed. I developed what became my framework for developing others: diagnostic assessment, customized development, and progressive challenge escalation. Diagnostic assessment means identifying each person's natural risk tolerance, decision-making preferences, and learning style before designing their development approach. Customized development means adapting teaching methods to individual psychological patterns rather than using standardized approaches. Progressive challenge escalation means gradually increasing the complexity and stakes of practice situations to build confidence through accumulated success. The organizational impact of systematic teaching exceeded my expectations. Units led by commanders who had learned these principles consistently outperformed units led by traditionally trained officers, even when facing superior enemy forces. More importantly, these units developed adaptive capabilities that allowed them to handle unexpected situations without requiring constant guidance from senior leadership. In modern business and career contexts, teaching others becomes a multiplier for your own effectiveness and influence. Professionals who can develop capabilities in others create value that extends far beyond their individual contributions. Teams led by people who can teach strategic thinking to their members consistently outperform teams that depend solely on leader decision-making. The key insight is that teaching others to think strategically about risk creates organizational cultures that reward intelligent risk-taking, while learning systematically from both successes and failures. This builds competitive advantages that persist regardless of personnel changes and adapt automatically to changing circumstances. Most importantly, teaching others forces you to articulate principles clearly enough that they can be learned, applied, and adapted by people with different backgrounds and perspectives. This clarity strengthens your own strategic thinking while creating lasting influence through the success of those you have developed. As I reach the end of my years and reflect on a lifetime of calculated risks, victories, and lessons learned through both triumph and failure, I realize that the most important battle plan I can leave behind is not a record of past campaigns, but a framework for future victories that have yet to be fought. The artifact that represents this final teaching is an unwritten battle plan, a blank strategic document that symbolizes the unlimited potential for you to apply these principles to challenges I could never have imagined. The art of calculated risk is not a collection of tactics to memorize, but a way of thinking that transforms uncertainty from an enemy into an ally. Every principle I have shared, from reading invisible battlefields to building strategic alliances, from conquering internal fears to creating generational advantages, represents one aspect of a comprehensive approach to decision-making that can be adapted to any competitive environment. When I began my military career, I believed that success came from avoiding risk through superior preparation and overwhelming force. Experience taught me that this approach leads to paralysis in a world where perfect information is impossible and overwhelming force is rarely available. True mastery comes from embracing uncertainty while minimizing its dangers through systematic analysis, strategic positioning, and adaptive execution. The framework I have developed through decades of warfare applies to every significant decision you will face in your career, business ventures, and personal growth. Whether you are evaluating a job change, launching a business, entering a new market, or pursuing any goal that involves uncertainty and competition, the principles remain constant. Gather sufficient information without waiting for perfect clarity. Calculate probability and impact within acceptable margins of error. Position yourself to capitalize on opportunities while protecting against catastrophic losses. And maintain the flexibility to adapt when circumstances change. But knowledge without application is merely entertainment. The difference between understanding these principles and benefiting from them lies in your willingness to begin applying them immediately to real decisions in your life. Start with smaller, manageable risks, where the consequences of failure are tolerable, while the lessons from success or failure will build your confidence and capabilities for larger challenges. I challenge you to identify one significant decision you are currently facing and apply the complete framework I have taught you. Assess what information you have versus what you actually need. Calculate the probability and potential impact of different outcomes. Evaluate your resources honestly and design an approach that matches your capabilities. Consider how this decision fits into your longer-term strategic objectives rather than just immediate benefits. Most importantly, recognize that the greatest risk in your life is not taking calculated risks, but allowing fear of uncertainty to prevent you from pursuing opportunities that could transform your circumstances. Every day you spend seeking perfect security is a day your competitors use to advance their positions, develop their capabilities, and capture advantages that could have been yours. The strategic principles that won ancient battles can win modern competitions because human nature, competitive dynamics, and the mathematics of uncertainty remain constant across time and cultures. What changes are the specific circumstances, the technologies, markets, and social structures, but the underlying logic of strategic thinking applies universally. Your strategic legacy begins with the next calculated risk you take. It grows through consistent application of these principles to increasingly significant challenges. It culminates when others look to you for guidance because your track record of intelligent risk-taking has established you as someone who understands how to navigate uncertainty successfully. The unwritten battle plan that represents your potential contains victories more significant than any I achieved, because you will face opportunities and challenges that did not exist in my time. Your success will come not from copying my specific tactics, but from adapting these timeless principles to circumstances that require fresh thinking and innovative approaches. Remember that calculated risk is not about guaranteeing success, it is about maximizing your probability of success while ensuring that failures become learning experiences rather than catastrophic defeats. Build your strategic legacy one intelligent decision at a time, and you will discover that what once seemed like impossible challenges become manageable problems with clear solutions. The battlefield awaits your leadership. Your strategic legacy begins now.